Kia ora and welcome to the Courage Club. The Courage Club is for us, parents or caregivers of deaf, disabled, medically fragile or neurodivergent children. If you're just joining the conversation, I encourage you to start listening from episode 1. We've created the Courage Club so we have a space to have some brave chats about our kids, disability and sexual safety. We know our children are particularly at risk. We also know that as parents of disabled and neurodivergent children, it's really easy to feel isolated, exhausted and anxious. So we want to help by beginning the conversation. Today in our second episode, we're talking about sexual safety with our kids. And that doesn't actually mean talking about it. We chat about helping your young tamariki to communicate about their bodies and their feelings and tuning into it, creating a space where these conversations are normalised and balancing body autonomy in medical or care environments. Easy, huh? We all want to protect our kids from harm, and parents and caregivers of disabled children can face many challenges. We hope you find some support in this conversation. Welcome to the Courage Club. So we've talked a little bit about how we really want to have these conversations with our tamariki about their bodies, their safety, sex and sexuality. But I guess kind of talking about it is one thing, but how do we actually do it? And I think I find I'm really I have lots of ideals around how I want to be open and honest, and I have lots of principles around how I want to tackle this, but I'm just not sure I know how to do it in the nitty-gritty. Do you feel like you know what you're doing and you know what to do when it comes to talking to your tamariki about their bodies?
I totally in the same place as you with that. I feel like I have all these aspirations to be open and say the right thing, but then I end up getting uncomfortable and squeamish for some reason anyway. So it takes a real leap of courage, I guess, to have that really open and honest conversation around body autonomy and agency. You know, there's things that I try and do at home, which is try and constantly reinforce that there's nothing intrinsically wrong or bad about her body. You know, she gets, probably because of her weight and because of her size, there's going to be people who judge her and look at her and think there's something wrong with her. And that's that constantly trying to not use language which supports that. We try and very carefully use language around that doesn't cast any moral aspersions, I guess, on somebody's body being wrong or bad. So we talk about a quiet side or a quiet hand, a quiet foot, a busy hand, a busy foot, and that, you know, sometimes it needs extra support.
Yeah.
You know?
And it is really hard when you're I think you've really summed up that it's so complex and it's such a changeable thing because, you know, with people don't often talk about with autism, with the mobility issues that you have, and particularly with dyspraxia, a highly physical disability. And so those things of having to change a child's nappy when they're a lot older than other children are already out of nappies, and how you need to build up their sense of their body and what it does. But how do you do that when they don't know what's happening with their own body? Like, this is something that I struggle with so much with. My son can't tell when he needs to go to the toilet. He can't necessarily make connections between physical pain and what's happening with his body. And that is something I've really tried to navigate, like what what activities can we do to make him feel more inside his body? And, I never thought that it would be the case, but I found that discussions about bodies and how we live in our bodies and how we stay safe in our bodies are actually like physical, interactive things we do together, like saying, stamp your feet. Do you feel them on the ground? Do you feel what that feels like coming up your leg and on your knees when you jump? I didn't think that the conversation would be so much like that, because a lot of what we do as parents of disabled or neurodivergent tamariki, it's kind of isolated from how other people are parenting. So you think the talk is like this sit-down thing, when actually it's every time you do physiotherapy, it's every time you do occupational therapy.
It's not like just a 15 minutes once, it's like an ongoing thing, eh?
And it's repeated over and over, because the questions keep, and often in that neurodivergent space, that constant repetition over, and it might be exactly the same question with exactly the same answer. And that's really hard to keep fresh.
Yeah, and I think for our children, as do all children, who struggle with emotional regulation, it's just even recognising how they're feeling. So you have to talk and work with them so much more on that. I remember our son was quite a bit older and just quite distressed, and he came out with, "I've got storms all over me." And I just thought that was such an amazing insight for him to say how discombobulated his body was feeling. And so, absolutely what you're saying, Emily, it's a physicality in your body, but they can't necessarily interpret that because they may not have the language, or they might not even recognise that the two things are related.
Yeah, or just the conceptualization of it is different, because I'm going to 100% use that I have storms all over my body all the time now. That's just going to be how I explain the situation. I think in our household, we really try, like the sort of line is that all bodies are okay. Like all bodies are just doing their body things, and there are so many variables about what body things different bodies do, and it's all okay. And that is like, people can feel however they want to about their own bodies. And so, like a while ago there was that expression like all bodies are great bodies, and it's like actually sometimes you don't feel like that about your own body. And so like it can be like all bodies are okay is a bit more neutral. Because but also just like the facts, we just try and be real factual, because like what you're saying, Lena, like we want to talk about things from a real strengths-based place, and we want to be real empowering, but then sometimes you don't feel very strengths-based in your body. And so to create a neutral space for people to feel, for the kids to feel however they want to feel about their bodies at that time, and for them to feel safe to express any challenges that they're having been in their bodies or whatever, as well as being able to celebrate being in their bodies. Like that's what I'm trying to foster, is like you can feel however you want to feel about your body in this house, and that is okay. Because I also don't want them to grow up being like, no, my body has to be perfect, I have to optimize myself in every way, shape or form, because actually like I've had
I really love that, because I think body neutrality is not something we really push, this body positivity thing, which I think is very important. But I also think, I've had my child at 7 years old turn around to me and say, I hate my body. I want a pancreas that works. And there's no way I'm going to turn around and validate those feelings. We have had I remember seeing him once, and he was just like churning. He was having such a difficult time with that real sinking in of this is a lifelong chronic illness. And I said, what would help? Let's talk about, let's come together. And he was saying, I'm just so angry. I just hate diabetes. And then he said, am I allowed to say that I hate diabetes? And I was like, of course you are. And then somehow, I don't know how it ended up happening. It might have been my husband's idea, but we ended up all on the balcony yelling out, fuck diabetes. And he loved it because he's never sworn, and he's quite he's a rule boy. He really likes rules. But he was yelling out, "Fuck diabetes." And I was like, this is great. Separating out as much as we can that some bodies don't work the way we want them to. And we're not going to sugarcoat that.
Yeah.
Like, pun unintended. But, we're not going to, we're going to have a real conversation here. And that real conversation is that we can have a lot of different feelings about our bodies.
Yeah.
So I really love that. I'm going to take that and use that in my whare, what you said.
And I also want to point out that we're trailblazers, by the way, because, historically our children wouldn't have lived with us. They would have been taken from us, put in institutions. You couldn't possibly look after that child. And the other side of the coin is, disabled people are completely asexual. They don't think about anything like that. Yeah. So we're fighting, because I do feel like we fight a lot, but we're advocating for a huge change that, really historically, it's not like we can go, this is how we do it, because we're creating this as we go along.
It's like teaching your kids to advocate for themselves in imperfect conditions. Like, advocate for yourself.
Yes.
You might not get the result that you are aiming for, but you can still advocate. And the conditions may be imperfect, but you can still say what you want, what your ideal is. You can still have have a goal.
So how do we pay attention to or recognise when our children are trying to communicate with us about their bodies, how they're feeling, or what they need?
Yeah, for my kids, verbal communication wasn't their go-to. And for my middle child in particular, it took a long time for her to even be able to point to things, to communicate in that way, that this is something I want, so I can point to it. And I feel like her understanding of her how she was interfacing with the world and my understanding of how my kids should be interfacing with the world were quite different. And it took a while to sort of reconcile that and figure out, from my point of view, how to recognize her communication style. And when she was real wee, there were lots of assumptions that I sort of had about these are the signs you recognize. Your child will do this when they're hungry. Your child will call out when they do this. They'll do this when they're tired, and you sort of, that's what you told her in antenatal class, and that's what you read in the books and blah, blah, blah. But actually not all kids are like that. No. And so that was a whole set of assumptions that I had to throw out. And it really, that I remember realizing how, and I was like, oh my God, I fucked up. To have not, turned myself on to lining up with her communication style. And I felt like a real ding-dong. But once I sort of got over that, and I was like, okay, I need to really, really pay attention here and be observing, because she's communicating with me. Yeah. I just need to know how to read it. And once we got through that, it made the situation so much easier. So I think, if you have a kid who's non-verbal or they use different types of communication, then, give yourself grace, but, think really widely, think really broadly when you're thinking about communication, because it's not just the verbal stuff. Yeah, so even, being aware of how... We talk a lot about our feelings. We talk a lot about, where our bodies are in space, and we talk a lot, each evening my middle kid does the most beautiful thing. It lines up with when the dogs start doing it as well, but she gets the zoomies, we call it the zoomies, and she bounds she does a circuit around the house, down the hall, into her room, does the circuit of just the most joyful bounding. And it's that is something that we've really embraced, because she's so physically present in her body. She's just enjoying the sensation of being in her body. And so And she's only 8. So, like, being able to, from that point, be like, yeah, how does that feel in your body? Like, that's a real celebratory thing. What's your brain feeling? What are your emotions doing when you're doing this? And so being able to even start the conversation at those young ages with like, oh, this is what your body's doing here. How does that make you feel? What are your emotions when that's happening? And then those are the conversations that you can then build on once you get into like puberty, sexuality, that sort of stuff.
Love that, Kiki.
That's cool.
Yeah. For us, I think words were also slow to come, but it feels like when they did come, they came really strong. It's become it's been a long, hard little journey of trying to get her to communicate verbally, and now she's starting to really do it, and she's starting to very much talk about her body and how she feels, not only in her body but also in her mind, and how she's feeling emotionally. So it feels like the last few years we've just been sort of surviving, trying to interpret her, and now we're starting to kind of get her, and she's starting to understand that we get her. And she'll come to us and she'll be upset about something, and she's like, I'm just having really big emotions today. And we'll delve into that. Why are you having big emotions? What are they about? And we'll just sort of start talking a bit more about those. And that's, I think, that feels like a real coup. Like you feel like you're not longer just surviving. You're like, oh, have we nailed something? I don't know. There's something quite Pandora's box. Like I've opened something that we can enjoy together here. And I think it all feeds back to that kind of her knowing herself and where her limits are, and her being able to communicate and be listened to.
What you've just described is like, you get that when you manage to create a home environment or like an environment or a relationship with your kids that's so safe that they feel confident coming to you and safe coming to you with this stuff. And like that's something that we're always striving for at home, and it's not something that I knew how to do before I was a parent. And I've been really, really intentional with how I parent and how the other parent figures in my kids' lives are around my kids. And because that creating that safe environment for them to come and speak their truth is so important to me. Like fundamentally, like if I couldn't do that, I'd be like absolutely gutted. Yeah. But and that also is a moving feast, because sometimes you're like, I need to create this safe environment no matter what. And that is what I can control. But actually, you can't control everything. It's like, I think when we think about, especially like around like sexual harm and that sort of thing, we like our go-to as humans is like, oh, well, we just need to get rid of all harm. We just need to stop it happening. And that's impossible. We messy, complex humans who live in community. So I'm like, okay, well, if we can't do that, what's the alternative is to like create such a healthy, supportive, nurturing environment that when harm happens, the kids can come to this environment and be absolutely safe to speak their truth and to then deal with the harm in whatever way. And part of that has really arisen from, we go to the hospital, which is, ostensibly you go there and you get made better and you heal and blah, blah. It's such a harmful environment. Yeah. And so we come home from that. That's like often just absolutely harrowing. Like we have had years of like trying to make that as good and manageable as it can be. And so making the home really safe for the for my oldest to come and say whatever she wants to say about that. And like, there was even things like when she was little, it's like, and she would be in hospital and the nurses would come in and they'd be like, oh, we'll just do this procedure in her bed. And I'd be like, absolutely not. You're not doing any of those procedures in her room because this needs to remain a safe space for her. So we will go to the procedure room. That can be the site of trauma, but she needs a safe space. And so just like there's been little tricks that we've learned over the years of how to build a really safe, supportive environment.
I think sometimes what helps me with my youngest with creating that safe space around neurodivergency is just really putting my expectations of what I think should happen, or the plans that I've made. Like when I've made this plan of I'm going to take you to see the orchestra or something that I've really planned because of a special interest or something, and he'll say, no, I need Ronnie time. And that means he needs to sit in his room by himself for a period of time, and he'll come out when he's ready. And I need to go, that time is sacred. That is part of his way of expressing something that's very hard for him and knowing what his feelings are and that type of thing. So a lot of it is around changing my expectations and what I think should happen. And I think in terms of what can be so challenging around, really picked up on what you said around the hospital environment, because I think what is very challenging is when you are trying to keep your child alive. That becomes this thing that's the most important thing over everything else. But over time, we realised that his emotional well-being was just as important as his physical well-being, and that's a really hard thing to hold. So, when he was first diagnosed and he was, we had to hold him down while he was injected. It was a very traumatic, violent thing. And we had to very quickly go, okay, how can we make this as much as possible a safer environment so he still feels in charge of his body? And that's things like him choosing where he is injected, him choosing, what sites where his continuous glucose monitor goes, as much as possible saying to the nurses and doctors, we need you to be on our team in partnership to protect his wairoa as well as like his, his physical and emotional. And I've found that challenging. My husband and I have both found it challenging to speak up to doctors and people in positions of power, because culturally it's not something we're necessarily used to doing, and it can be quite intimidating in a health environment. I think finding your voice is really important as a parent of a child with disability.
I nearly think it goes the other way around though as well, where I've always been the advocate and I've always been the voice for my child, and it's letting go of that control. And actually now she's 7, she's a whole person, and she can go into an appointment with a specialist and she can answer all the questions. And I have this overriding urge to answer all the questions. And I just need to be like, just shut the fuck up. She's got this.
Yeah.
She recently broke her thumb at the hospital getting a cast put on. The doctor said, has she got a short sleeve shirt underneath this? Can we take it off so we can put the cast on her arm? And I said, yeah, we'll just strip it off. And he said, actually, that's up to Elliot. And I just thought, God, that's beautiful. He's actually straight away gone, no, it's actually her call if she's happy to be stripped down without the curtain being closed and him in the space. And Elliot I then deferred to Elliot. I was like, are you comfortable with him being there? Do you want the curtain closed? She was like, no, that's fine. And so it happened and it was great. But I just thought that sort of moment of control that she had, and it's constantly trying to battle my own self. Like, actually, I need to just let her have that control and that autonomy over her body and over her own procedures that are happening to her.
I relate to that so much. I just want to be the one in charge and answer all the questions, because I want to take the burden
from
him.
The fight, right?
But he wants to be independent and he wants freedom.
I think it's really interesting picking up on what you all said, but particularly Kiki, who started it, is you create this beautiful, nurturing, safe environment for them where, they're okay. I just want to reassure you a bit, as a parent of adults, that doesn't just stay in the physical four walls of your house. They take that with them. They do. They absolutely do. Even when you think they're not going to, and you've told them something 5 million times and you know what this is like. You know, like I think, and this is a sex sort of example. Our son at the age of 17 was approached sexually by another man who was slightly older. He knew that he liked girls, you know, and, you know, he knows lots of gay people, but he understands that, but he knew that he liked girls. And so when this approach was made, he thought it was funny, which you can imagine completely diffused the entire situation, because I'm sure it put the other person off. And he goes, no, don't do that. Don't pull my togs down. I like girls. I don't, you know, I like to cuddle girls, you know. And because of the teaching around all the stuff that we're talking about in there, because he understood that about himself, that protected him. So he took that safe space, which he had learnt, like all your children are, in, you know, your little four walls, and he took that knowledge and comfort and safety where he could advocate for them himself. And don't get me wrong, he's autistic as, you know, he's not... you know, Einstein or Bill Gates or anything, but he knows what he wants, he knows what he likes, and he was able to advocate for himself. So look, this is so beautiful that your children are starting to do it. Kudos, mums.
That's really comforting.
I think the idea of the, you know, the safe space at home is, I feel like my big example of that is my two boys came to me, very serious looks on their faces, and came up and said, Mum, we have to tell you something. Because as we know, if we've got neurodivergent children, screens are amazing. They are regulation, they are entertainment, they are a safe thing. So my youngest spends a lot of time on screens. And I've talked so much about screens. If you see anything, you tell Mama. If it makes you uncomfortable, if it makes your tummy hurt, I've tried to think of all these things. You tell Mama. You won't get in trouble. We'll just talk about it. So they both came to me very serious, and they said, Mama, we saw porn. And I was like, oh, okay. And I said, all right, what happened? And they said, well, Dad was in the kitchen watching porn, and he said that we could watch it with him. And I was like, what? And they were like, the porn was in a garage. And I was like, what is happening? And then I found out they meant this reality TV show called Porn Stars, which is about like a pawn shop, antique shop or something.
Oh, that's so cute.
About to have a nervous breakdown. I was like, okay,
misjudged this.
that's all right. I just don't know the man I've been with for 22 years. And I told my husband, and he was like wheeze laughing, and then he suddenly went, oh my gosh, what if they've told people at school that I watch porn with them? So that was my test of like, okay, maybe they do trust that they can tell me stuff. So, but that's been the interesting thing with like, you think that like the conversation is like your body or like sexuality, who you like, who you know, feel comfortable with, sex and all that, but it's also porn and what you see online and you know, social constructs around gender and sexuality and all that, and it's just like a whack-a-mole trying to I'm exhausted. And I think like balancing teaching body autonomy with the necessary medical procedures, the hygiene care, intimate care, that balance can be hard. With my youngest, I find it very hard how I have to spend a lot of time bringing him out of disassociation, bringing him into the moment when I'm doing intimate care, hygiene care, because I've got to, you know, I do things like counting and singing a song that he has to sing some of the words to just keep him in the present when I'm cleaning him, changing him, that type of thing. And I just wonder if do you feel the same or have similar things around keeping our kids present, or like do you think that's important when we're trying to do this sort of intimate care or touching their bodies in a medicalised way?
I find one thing that we do, and like especially in like a hospital setting with my oldest, and like it's interesting because often the doctors and nurses don't, like, they would not recommend this, but my oldest gets to like look at their tray of instruments, like ask questions about it. She gets to decide where she sits. She gets to decide, you know, as much as she can about how the procedure happens, and gets to watch the procedure happening, like if it's a blood test or something. And when she was younger, the nurses and doctors would really discourage that. They'd be like, we'll distract you with a screen. But actually, like, she's always wanted to be really, really present. Meanwhile, I'm over here dissociating, being like... But, like, it's actually been, like, sort of a reverse roles where her need to be present in those situations has really forced me to be really present in those situations as well. And I think that that's something, like, us and her team have learnt over time as well, is that actually that can be so empowering.
Because I guess it's like you bring your own, the things we learn over time around safety in our bodies and that type of thing. And it feels like, you know, I want my child to, when things are happening to his body, to him be present and understanding of what's happening to his body, because that feels protective. But I don't know if it is or not. It's one of those things, I guess, that, you know, when you go through life and you're like, oh, that feels true, that thing. But has there anything that's kind of surprised you about this sort of journey of helping your kids understand their bodies, their, you know, having these talks about sexual safety, sexuality, sex?
I think the thing that I found most surprising is how these conversations come up in the most unassuming ways. Like, we'll be cooking dinner and one of the kids will ask me a question about periods, or we'll be, you know, like just sat there watching TV and then a question will come up about something, and how these conversations are just threaded through everything. And it's not that 15-minute conversation that you have with your kids once when they're 10 years old, that is just like embedded in everyday life. And I think that just normalizing it like that is made my job easier. But also it's just like, it's real normal for the kids to ask these questions. It's real normal for them to have this curiosity, and it's real normal for them to, for us to just talk about it factually. But it'll also be like, Mum, what's a period? And then like, oh, look over there. So where do giraffes live? You know, like it's just another fact. Yeah.
I feel it's a little bit like all this time that, you know, 10 years of parenting for me so far, it's like sprinkling all these little seeds, and then like I'm starting to see the flowers growing. I'm starting to see the work that I felt like it didn't land back then, and now I'm starting to see like it's all coming together. It's really beautiful. It's also, I'm realising that it's never too late to change tack and to learn new things and to just help. It's all water for the garden. Like, I really love that, you know, every little bit has been helpful along the journey.
Yeah.
Thanks for listening to the Courage Club. We really hope that helped. There's been lots of work behind the scenes for this podcast, so thank you to all our parents, whānau and young people who shared their stories with us to inform this kōrero. And a shout out to all of our advisors, particularly our partners at Help Auckland and RPE for keeping us safe. If you want to find further resources after listening to this conversation, there's more info on our website, www.courageclub.co.nz. See you next time.